E ngā iwi, e ngā mana, e ngā hoa mahi. Tēnā koutou katoa. E mihi ana ki a koutou, kua tai mai ki tau toko tēnei kaupapa. Ko Dominic Stevens tōku ingoa, nau mai haere mai ki te tai o ohanga. So welcome everybody to the launch of He Tirohanga Mokopuna, the long-term fiscal statement for 2025. I'm Dominic Stevens, Chief Economic Advisor at the Treasury. He Tirohanga Mokopuna is the second of three stewardship reports that Treasury is launching during 2025. Earlier in the year, we launched the Long-term Insights Briefing, which deals with fiscal policy over the economic cycle. Today's Long-term Fiscal Statement deals with the sustainability, long-term sustainability of fiscal policy. And later this year, we'll launch the Investment Statement, which deals with the government's balance sheet. So just before we get underway, a little bit of housekeeping for those in the room. If there's a fire alarm, please follow Treasury staff to the nearest exit and progress down the stairwell. Do not use the lifts. If there's an earthquake, please drop, cover and hold and stay in the building until instructed by a warden. Bathrooms are down the corridor just to the left of the kitchenette. In terms of the order of events today, I'll start by giving a brief overview of the document. Then I'll invite Treasury Secretary Iain Rennie to give the on-the-record launch speech for the document. Then we'll have a question and answer session. For those in the room, it'll be a traditional raise your hand and we'll endeavour to answer your questions. For those online, I understand there's considerably more online than in the room, use the Q&A function to put your question in. Others can like your question and we'll endeavour to answer the most popular ones and strike a balance between online and in person. So the long-term fiscal statement provides a 40-year outlook on New Zealand's fiscal future to assess the legacy that we're leaving future New Zealanders. The main message of the document is that New Zealand fiscal policy is not currently on a sustainable path. Change needs to happen. New Zealanders pay or contribute the most to the public purse during the middle of their lives through paying the most taxation. But they withdraw the most from the public purse through receipt of New Zealand superannuation and health benefits late in life. As we live longer lives and as birth rates remain low, the number of people aged over 65 is rising faster than the number of people in midlife. In 1960, there were 7 people aged between 50 and 64 for every person aged 65 and over. Today, there are 4, and we project that in 2065, there will be 2. What this means is that if current policies remain unchanged, government spending will rise faster than revenue, and debt will balloon to 200% of GDP by 2065. Now, this is not a prediction. This is an extrapolation of current policies. It's what would happen if nothing changes. Of course, Treasury firmly expects that change will happen to avert this debt trajectory. And what the long-term fiscal statement is really about is what those changes will be and when they'll happen. Of course, it's not just population ageing that affects our fiscal future. There are other pressures on the government's long-term finances like climate change, defence spending, and infrastructure spending. Now, Treasury's been beating this drum for 20 years and delivering much the same message. And actually, when we look back, some demographic and economic factors have proved less challenging to the public purse than anticipated in early long-term fiscal statements. The biggest surprise has been migration. The net migration has been much stronger than projected in early long-term fiscal statements, and consequently that has delayed the process of population ageing for New Zealand. Labour force participation has proved a lot higher than projected earlier, which means there are more New Zealanders contributing to the public purse than was anticipated. And interest rates have proved lower, which helps with the cost of debt servicing. But despite these helpful developments, we find ourselves today with government debt levels that are in fact higher than was projected in most past long-term fiscal statements. That's partly due to big government responses to disaster events like the Canterbury earthquakes and COVID, But it's also partly because fiscal policy choices over 20 years have not always addressed long-run challenges. Now, the future is, of course, uncertain. So that's the focus of chapter 2 of the document. The first thing to say is that we found similar-ish results using 2 different models. One, the traditional long-term fiscal model, which is what we've used in past long-term fiscal statements and has a lot of detail about fiscal policy. And one, our new overlapping generations model, which has a modelling of the interaction between fiscal policy, people's behaviour, and the economy, and contains feedback loops. Now, admittedly, the results do depend on the assumptions we make, which are themselves uncertain. But even if we imagine a benign future in which a confluence of things are less challenging for fiscal policy, such as interest rates at 2.5% rather than 4.3% assumed in our baseline, migration assumed to be 100,000 per annum, labour force participation and productivity growth stronger than assumed in our baseline. Even if we imagine that more benign future is in front of us, some adjustment would still be required to render fiscal policy sustainable, because the no policy change debt path is still rising. And in a more adverse possible future where, let's say, we assume interest rates are 6%, labour force participation, productivity growth and migration are all lower than in the baseline, well, in that world, much more adjustment would be required than in the baseline. And what this is telling us is that it's unlikely that taking steps towards more sustainable fiscal policy would be a mistake. Chapter 3 of the document explores the options for fiscal sustainability. And the first message that we give is that acting early will pay dividends. So if the only policy change we make to stabilise debt is to gradually lift labour income taxes enough to keep debt stable, well, those labour income taxes on our modelling would have to rise from an average of 21% now to 32% in 2065. If instead we kick the can down the road 40 years and then hike taxes to stabilise debt at that point, labour income taxes would have to go to 36%. That would be an extra $2,000 per person per annum in tax, which would be a drag on the economy, leaving future generations with smaller GDP per person and permanently lower incomes. We've also modelled the value of pre-announcing policies, which gives people time to adjust their own savings and leads to a smoother transition path. Now, Chapter 3 goes through a wide range of potential policy options. It's important to remember that this is a menu rather than a recommendation. So Treasury has costed a wide range of things that future governments might want to consider rather than recommending any particular policy. Starting with pension reform, in order to keep New Zealand superannuation stable as a percentage of GDP, so that's not sufficient to plug the entire fiscal gap, it just addresses the pension part, we could index New Zealand superannuation to inflation rather than wages, so it grows more slowly. We could achieve the same fiscal saving by increasing the age of eligibility to 72 by 2065. Or we could means test, but that would have to kick in at very low levels of non-super income and would affect incentives for people over the age of 65 to work. Of course, boosting savings would be a very important part of the mix, and so that's also discussed in the document. Now, the big advance in this long-term fiscal statement compared to previous editions is analysis and modelling of the winners and losers from various policies. So, for example, this chart shows that for indexing superannuation to inflation, median income earners born from 2037 onwards are better off than the counterfactual of plugging the fiscal gap by lifting taxes. So it's true, those people born after 2037 will receive lower super than the counterfactual late in life, but earlier in life they'll have a lifetime of lower taxes. And in fact, those lower tax rates would also breed a stronger economy, leading to lower incomes as well. And so those benefits for those people would outweigh the cost of lower super. For median income earners born before 2037, the opposite is true. The reduction in super is more important to them than the gain from lower taxes and higher incomes. We also break things down by income level. And what it shows is that although on our modelling, all income groups of future New Zealanders end up better off under this policy, future high-income New Zealanders have a greater net gain than future low-income New Zealanders under this policy. So there's a similar analysis for a range of policies in the document, and I encourage you to have a look at the detail. Moving beyond pension reform, we looked at a range of other options. We looked at controlling health costs through the likes of user pays, population health measures, or efficiency measures, and concluded that that is unlikely to be enough to plug the whole fiscal gap. If we did want to stabilise debt using just one policy option, you'd have to make big changes in that policy area. So for example, if it was just on cost control in non-health government services, well, those expenditure on those would have to drop to 5% of GDP from 13% now. If we relied entirely on lifting GST, it would have to go from 15% now to 32% by 2065. And if we relied entirely on lifting labour income taxes, as I've already mentioned, they'd have to go from an average of 21% now to 32%. And of course, there are other tax options than GST and labour income taxes, including broadening the base and thinking about how we tax capital. To offset, so non-super welfare spending is not big enough on its own to be a candidate for plugging the whole fiscal gap, but just to offset the rising cost of New Zealand's super, other welfare spending would have to fall to 2.2% of GDP from an average of 5.7% in recent decades. The upshot of all of this is that if we relied on a single policy to try to plug the fiscal gap, very large changes would be required in that area. And so it seems more likely that a composite or perhaps a rolling maul or a range of options is going to be a preferable option. Now, there's a very wide range of ways that governments could go with this in future. Treasury has modelled up one composite scenario that involves gradually lifting the age of eligibility to 68, constraining health cost growth by 0.25 percentage point per annum through efficiency and perhaps user pays measures, constraining growth in other government expenditure so that it falls as a proportion of GDP by 1.4 percentage points over 40 years, and lifting the rate of GST gradually from 15% to 24%. And this illustrative combination on our modelling would be sufficient to stabilise debt and wouldn't require increases in labour income taxes. As I say, this is just one illustration of the type of combination that might be necessary. So look, that's a brief summary of the document. I encourage you and hope that you enjoy reading the details. There's much more in the document, and we at the Treasury are certainly hoping that the long-term fiscal statement will inform the discussion that New Zealand needs to have on the sustainability of fiscal policy. With that, I will invite Treasury Secretary Iain Rennie to give the launch speech. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dom. And firstly, I'd like to acknowledge all of my colleagues here in the Treasury who've been involved in putting together the long-term fiscal statement. It really is a team effort, and I'm very proud of the work that the organisation has put into this. I'd also like to particularly acknowledge Dom's contribution. Dom decided earlier this year, after 4 years in Treasury, he was going to move on to his next set of opportunities, but he agreed to stay on and steward the long-term fiscal statement. I'm very grateful, Dom, both for your work at the Treasury over the last 4 years and your work on this. That's been great. Thank you. We call the long-term fiscal statement He Tirahanga Mokopuna, an intergenerational perspective. This is now the 6th edition of the LTFS, and we continue to use its insights to inform our advice to successive governments and to support the public dialogue to ensure that fiscal policy choices are future focused. He Tirahanga Mokopuna reflects a wish for our mokopuna to inherit not just the challenges of today, but also the capability to meet them and thrive. The Treasury is privileged to be able to step back from the day-to-day treadmill of public policy and look forward in this way. I've spoken many times this year about my desire to focus on what I think are the core economic and fiscal challenges that New Zealand faces. I've described this as the challenge of bending two curves. The first curve being our long-term economic growth trajectory, which needs to bend upwards through a lift in productivity. The second curve is our net public debt trajectory, which needs to bend downwards to rebuild the fiscal buffers that have underpinned our national resilience. The statement is clearly a document that focuses on that second curve. This is a document that by design and statute is about fiscal challenges. And in one sense, the conclusions are stark. We are showing that if changes to the underlying policy settings are not made, then New Zealand's public services will not be sustainable over the long term. But our role is not just to call attention to the scale of challenges, but to give some measure of the range of possible solutions. In that spirit, I want to emphasise 4 key strategic policy lessons that New Zealanders can learn from the analysis in the LTFS. The first lesson is that we have benefited from some good luck and good management over the past 20 years, yet public debt is still higher than we expected. In the first chapter of the LTFS, we reflect on some insights from producing these documents for nearly 20 years. One theme that emerges is that New Zealand has had some favourable economic tailwinds at our back that have delayed the emergence of some of the fiscal pressures, at least relative to what we expected in 2006. In simplest terms, national incomes have grown faster than we had projected. For example, in the year to June 2024, the nominal size of the economy was 26% higher than we had projected in the 2006 statement. Why has this been the case? To take one example, our labour force participation has been much higher, reflecting both high migration, but also the ongoing participation of older workers in the labour market. That is no small part a consequence of labour market settings which don't disincentivise individuals who want to extend their working lives. Another factor has been that New Zealand has benefited from a high terms of trade, which means that global prices have supported the growth of the goods and services we sell to the world. To some extent, this has been reinforced by a flexible business environment which has allowed firms to reorient their business models, and trade policy that has enabled New Zealand to gain and maintain market access to the growing consumers of our exports across the world. Perhaps it is counterintuitive, but I do think there is a note of optimism we can take from these findings. It speaks to some of the qualities of New Zealand's policy environment and the consistency of the policy frameworks under successive governments that have enabled this adaptation. However, the stark reality is that despite these favourable conditions, public debt now is still higher than we anticipated in most previous LTFSs. We show that net core crown debt is currently around 43% of GDP, when we had projected in 2006 that it would rise to only 23% of GDP now. The explanation for this difference is not mysterious. The last 20 years have seen a series of significant shocks, including the GFC, the Canterbury earthquakes, and COVID-19. Successive governments have used the Crown's fiscal headroom to help New Zealand respond and bounce back. We described these issues in some detail in our previous stewardship document this year, the Long-term Insights briefing. We said in that document since the late 1980s, the cost of government responses to economic shocks has averaged about 10% of GDP per decade. The Treasury has confidence that shocks will continue to hit New Zealand, although we can't predict their exact timing and magnitude. It is good management to expect bad luck. And this is why rebuilding our fiscal buffers prior to the next set of shocks is the cornerstone of the Treasury's advice to governments. That leads me to the second lesson, which is that the starting point matters. And the challenge we must first tackle is to close the current structural operating deficit. New Zealand has been running a structural operating deficit of around 2% of GDP for the past 2 years. This means that there is an underlying trend for the government to spend more than it is receiving in revenue, even after stripping out the effects of economic shocks in the business cycle. The Treasury estimates that the government has been structural deficit on average since 2019-20, and at the Budget Economic and Fiscal Update, we forecast a return to structural surplus in 2028-2029. According to the International Monetary Fund, New Zealand currently has one of the largest structural fiscal deficits among the advanced economies. The current government has committed to concrete steps to address the structural operating deficits as part of its fiscal strategy. This is consistent with the Treasury's strategic advice and will involve ongoing and significant reprioritisation of spending to maintain expenditure within forecast operating allowances. Our long-term projections in the LTFS assume that this will occur, as it is part of the BFU forecast we base our modelling on. If this fiscal strategy isn't delivered, then long-term sustainability will be harder to achieve. Closing the structural operating deficit is not about consolidation for its own sake. In my view, it is necessary to create a sustainable fiscal environment that allows New Zealand to tackle future challenges from a position of strength. This includes making space for high-value public investments while maintaining prudent levels of debt. The Treasury is on the record as advising that consolidation will require sustained effort and a mix of policy measures to increase revenue, reform transfers and subsidies, promote efficient use of the government balance sheet, and reduce government consumption. None of these choices is easy, but if we do not close the structural deficit, it will tighten the policy constraints over time. This could involve more drastic policy adjustments in the future than necessary and foreclose on some of the options we have as a nation for more gradual transitions. The modelling in LTFS bears this out, showing that there are real economic and social costs to delayed reform. The third lesson is the need to be clear-eyed about the long-term pressures of a changing world. The certainties of demography loom large in our assessment of the long term, and I don't want to rehearse those arguments here. However, while population ageing places substantial pressures on the fiscal position, we should also welcome significant improvement in life expectancy and the improved life choices that longevity offers New Zealanders. Many other countries face the same challenge of an ageing population, but that doesn't mean that we should be any less focused on them in New Zealand. However, as a nation, we are also exposed to a range of other challenges: adaptation to climate change, technological disruption, biosecurity threats, shifting tectonic plates, to rattle off just some examples. A new source of disruption has become apparent even in the last 4 years since we last published an LTFS. The fragmented geopolitical environment has direct fiscal consequences in how it has created demands for countries to increase their defence and security spending, which is reflected in our modelling in this edition. As we've seen just this year, widespread trade uncertainty can also severely disrupt an economy that is as reliant as we are on a stable rules-based order. For Treasury, this means that the maintenance of economic security is now a much more important lens to frame our advice, including fiscal policy advice. In the face of a much less favourable environment, the maintenance of fiscal sustainability is at the core about how we manage against those shocks. Though we will never be able to predict specific shocks, our fiscal strategy should expect that we will confront major shocks of some form, and potentially more frequently than in earlier times. The Treasury will always emphasise this, as I've already mentioned. It is not prudent to rely on a benign future. Our institutional perspective is to put a premium on the value of preserving options for New Zealand governments to respond to the consequences of a volatile world. The Treasury also needs to go beyond merely describing problems. We need to play a constructive role in shaping the policy environment system which helps to solve them. So I end then with my fourth lesson, that New Zealand continues to have options and that we don't need to tackle 40 years worth of pressures in one fell swoop. We are required by the Public Finance Act to look out 4 decades in providing the analysis in the LTFS. But that doesn't mean our strategic advice is to try to solve all the policy issues on that same horizon. As our review of 20 years of LTFSs illustrates, the future will unfold in ways that we can't foresee at this point. An effective adaptive strategy involves tackling the underlying structural issues that we can to give more options to future governments to work through the future as it unfolds. The analysis in this document supports that conclusion. In the third chapter, we show a series of modelling experiments to illustrate that multi-pronged fiscal strategies that involve change to tax and expenditure settings will help to moderate the scale of the challenges required than if any single policy lever is the focus for reform. And some of the modelling also shows that the sooner New Zealand can act, the smaller the adjustments we might need to make to get our long-term finances into a more sustainable shape. There is no simple answer to how transition costs should be shared across generations. However, starting earlier provides more opportunities to share those costs rather than leaving larger and more disruptive changes to both currently young and currently unborn generations. Nevertheless, modelling can only take you so far. There is a normative perspective underlying these conclusions, one that is rooted in Treasury's outlook as an economic advisor. So I want to end with two pieces of wisdom that sum up the case as I see it. The first aphorism comes from an economist, Rudy Dornbush, who's widely known for saying that in economics, things take longer to happen than you think they will, and then they happen faster than you thought they could. In this context, that speaks to me about the possibilities of progress on these problems and the ability of policymakers to make the choices they need to when the scale of the issues are well understood. New Zealand has tackled challenges like this before, and I have conviction that we will grasp the nettle again. This document is offered in the spirit of contributing to that conversation. The second piece of wisdom is grounded here in New Zealand. Ahakoa heiti, he ponamu, the whakatauki which evokes the idea that things that are small in scale can be significant in value. In this context, fiscal policy choices we make now can be of long-term consequence, and modest changes now might be of more value than we can fully understand. For me, the cover of the LTFS this year, which is an image captured by one of our staff, brings this to mind. Pounamu resting beneath gentle ripples of water, the tonga revealed as light shifts. Even as we navigate through the currents and swirls of our fiscal future, we can reach for that stone and hold fast to its worth. The LTFS is the platform from which we will reach out, steady and deliberate, to hold on to what is valuable for current and future generations. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Iain. So we'll now start the Q&A session. I'll sort of moderate it and we'll answer some of the questions if necessary. We've got obviously Iain and Peter Gardner, who's the manager responsible for the document and is the manager of the forecasting and modelling team at Treasury. So I'll start with some questions in the room. Well, there's a first hand that's gone up.
Thanks. Two questions. First, about the modelling that you showed in an earlier slide. You compared having no tax increase through to 2065 with having a steady increase in tax. And you showed a path for GDP under those two assumptions. And it was quite striking that holding taxes down gave you no boost to GDP in your model, and yet raising taxes suddenly dropped GDP. And I'd be interested to know what mechanism in the model produces that effect. The second thing is, did you guys put the Green Party's budget package into your model and see how it worked?
So the answer to the second question is no, just because there's many things we could do. We've got the modelling experts in the room, but I correct me if I'm wrong. It's agents in the model are forward-looking, and so is that.
In large part, it's the capital being crowded out by debt because you're running up a lot of debt during that period when you're not increasing taxes.
So the modelling is all covered in background papers and sort of encourage you to go back and
as labour supply falls, and I think from memory, you've got probably even more capital stock falling.
So, here.
In your 2021 version, your debt peak, I think, was 170%, and now it's up to 200%. what does that say about what we've done in the past 4 years?
Well,
That's on.
I think there are got to realise that the final debt forecast is a combination of a whole lot of factors. Some have actually worked in a positive direction. There are others. So I mentioned in my speech, in terms of defence spending, current government has got an expectation about raising defence spending from just under 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP by the early 2030s. We've assumed that continues through to 2060, and just arithmetically, if you're spending about 1% of GDP per year more over the next 40 years than we assumed in 2021, that's about 40% of GDP, roughly. So there are some policy assumptions that we've made that make that difference, and obviously we've got since the 2021, we've actually got, if you like, the fiscal starting point is a bit different. Debt is higher than we were forecasting at that time. So there's several factors: outturns, some technical assumption changes, some policy assumption changes. The net effect of those is negative in terms of the central projection for debt.
So we've got a couple of questions online that are sort of focusing in on the modelling. So haven't read the document in full detail, but wondering about net migration scenarios and how these impact on the sustainability of fiscal policy. Basically, stronger net migration delays the population ageing process and therefore delays the no policy change ramp up in debt. But it is only a delay rather than a complete removal of the long run issue. And that's because when you have stronger net migration, you do have more younger people for a time, but they themselves will age and become over 65 and will receive New Zealand superannuation and the like on current policies. So basically, net migration delays the hockey stick and the no policy change debt projections. There's also a question about some of the super-related policies, such as those suggested by Coleman and McCulloch. There's again a very wide range of things that we could have modelled, and we've done our best to sort of touch on a range of different things. We actually have the transition from a pay-as-you-go scheme to a save-as-you-go scheme, so greater savings in the meantime. In one of our forthcoming background papers, or I think discussed in two different background papers. Actually, the modelling results look fairly similar to the result qualitatively similar to the result that I put up for indexing super to inflation. Are there other questions in the room?
When was the modelling finalised? Presumably it was far too. Sorry. When was the modelling finalised? And presumably it was far too early to take in any new, quite noisy, but still quarterly GDP results. Like, is there any effect? I know it's very long term and it's very noisy now, but is there any effect from the deteriorating economic picture over the last 6 months?
I mean, the exact date, Peter, was.
So is that working?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the modelling was finalised earlier this year, before the most recent GDP numbers came out, but it does include updated projections, so population projections from Stats New Zealand, and our most recent economic forecast, which we published at budget.
There's a question over the side of the room.
What's the net effect of productivity growth in some of these forecasts? You have, net growth might affect revenues, but also could affect spending on the super side. So what do you see as being sort of the net impact of productivity growth in this modelling?
Well, I think as Iain's mentioned, productivity growth increases society's choice set more broadly. So it is in and of itself a desirable thing to have to increase our choice set. For example, in a competitive labour market for health, it can make health more affordable. But actually, in the sensitivity analysis contained in Chapter 2, you'll find that the results are very sensitive to the likes of interest rate, what interest rate we assume, what the skill level of migrants and the like, but not very sensitive on the fiscal side to productivity growth. And that is because these are current policy projections. Currently, New Zealand superannuation is required to be at a minimum of 66% of the average wage. So it tends to grow with wages. Stronger productivity growth means New Zealand superannuation grows more strongly. And similar thing with health costs, which are predominantly labour costs. Stronger productivity growth increases the cost of delivering a given amount of health. So the modelling results are not very sensitive to the productivity growth rate assumed, but productivity in and of itself is an important thing to boost. Is there anything you want to add to that?
I haven't read the document, but listening to your summary comments, there's a number of references to interest rates. The scale of the numbers you're using suggests that your references are to nominal interest rates.
Correct.
Why nominal rather than not real?
Well, real interest rates are definitely more important, but we've assumed 2% inflation in the modelling. So.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Luke Malpass from the Post. One of the, the overarching theme of this all seems to be you kind of can't face up to reality soon enough, and that the costs of delayed action are greater than starting to do things today. You also said that that these models are really extrapolations, and that you assume that there will be policy changes over time in order to deal with some of these. What does it look like if there aren't really particularly substantial policy changes for, say, the next decade?
I mean, you have to be pretty humble looking forward a decade. Collectively, as economists, we didn't do too well with the June quarter GDP, and that was looking backwards, let alone looking 10 years into the future. So I'd caveat it by that. I mean, I think over time, I think you'd see a series of adjustments essentially being, in one sense, forced on the economy. So if you take, for example, the statements of our rating agencies, they're on the record as saying they've got confidence in our fiscal institutions. They believe we will fiscally consolidate. If we don't, then at some point that's going to be reflected in, lower credit ratings. Credit worthiness will be different. There'll be adjustments, in the market that we can't necessarily predict around exchange rates and interest rates, because that will be playing out in the external economy. So I think you would see, whether it's gradual or more disruptive, pressures coming back through the onto the economy, and at least I suppose encouraging policymakers to change policy settings. So we're certainly not saying for 40 years it's going to be fine and then we'll have Armageddon. I think you'd see a set of adjustments that will occur. Now, none of us can say what that will quite look like or whatever timeframes, but I think if there was kind of no adjustment whatsoever over the next 10 years, then I think there would be, there'll be more, adjustment pressures back on the New Zealand economy.
So New Zealand policymakers can make choices.
So New Zealand policymakers and politicians can make choices today, otherwise the markets and those who buy our debt will foist choices upon us in the future. Is that a reasonable?
I mean, at the moment, like most small open economies, between 60 and 70% of our bonds are bought by foreigners. The confidence that people have in New Zealand economy, which is currently very high, confidence institutions very high, but it's actually something, as for us as a Treasury, that's something we're saying you should never be complacent about that and expect that as a given. people have confidence because they expect us to act in particular ways. And over time, if we don't act in particular ways, then there'll be adjustments.
I think we'll just go to an online question. Another one for you, Iain, is about sustainable or appropriate debt levels. So what does Treasury think is a sustainable, appropriate debt level, and what is that debt level for New Zealand?
I think there's a couple of levels to that. I mean, I think ultimately, what is an appropriate debt level? There's a political judgment there, societal judgment. I mean, I think as a Treasury, what we've said to governments is that the prudent level of debt is somewhat context specific. So there's no sort of enduring permanent level. The way we've gone about it is to think a bit about if we had a significant, shocks, what would be the extent of shocks that you could still, have that and then return to a more sustainable level of debt over time. And when we last looked at that formally in 2022, that gave us an answer of around about 50% of GDP in normal times.
Thanks, Iain. We'll take a couple in the room. Perhaps person who hasn't had a chance yet, and then.
Thanks, Mr. Stevens. Max Rashbrook. Was just interested in a couple of the quite sweeping statements you made on tax, including the idea that lower taxes would, quote, breed a stronger economy. But just looking at the graphs you've supplied, if we lowered the tax take in New Zealand, we would be down the end of the OECD where we join Mexico, Colombia, Turkey and Chile, which wouldn't have said we necessarily had economies that would aim to emulate, whereas the document says that if we funded these increased expenditure pressures from tax revenue, would be spending about generating revenue about 37% of GDP, and that would put us up amongst the Netherlands, Germany and Denmark, which look like pretty good economies on most people's readings. So not least because of all the multiplier effects of government spending if you spend it well. So things are a bit more complex than just saying lower taxes breed a stronger economy, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. So this is not. Yeah, absolutely. I think what you're talking about is size of government. So some countries choose low tax, low government spending. Some countries choose high tax, high government spending. Neither of those, there's not really strong evidence that either of those strategies has produced systematically better outcomes over time. No, what I was referring to is if we allow debt to build up, and we've got higher debt servicing permanently, we're having to tax people more without getting any particular benefit through greater government services. That is unambiguously a drag upon the economy and upon society, and would cost future generations. So, and I should also caveat that these are the results produced by our overlapping generations model, which it's fantastic modelling. It is only one model, and then there are greater complications out there in the economy.
Back question about interest rates. You noted that all projections are done on the basis of 2% inflation. On the assumption that your projections are also done on the basis of constant real interest rate?
Yes, so we've assumed a steady state. It's not constant. The assumed interest rate moves to 4.3%, and the assumed inflation rate moves to 2%. And then there's a 40-year projection over time.
But having got to that 4.3, it's then
stable. Yes, and that.
But yet, as our GDP converges on 200% of GDP in the change scenario, that real interest rate is going to go up quite sharply.
Yeah, that's correct. Actually, okay, so we're using two different models. The modelling, actually, our overlapping generations modelling experts might want to talk about the interest rate in that model.
Yeah, so in that model, the interest rate is endogenous. Initially, in the baseline projection, it goes down because of an aging population. They save more, but in the model where taxes aren't adjusting and debt goes up, because debt's crowding out capital, that pushes up the marginal product of capital and pushes up the real interest rate.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, we've used two different models. Traditionally, in past long-term fiscal statements, we've made static assumptions, such as a static interest rate assumption, and extrapolated it forward. And actually, some of the feedback has been, well, that's not what would happen if debt hockey sticks like that. So that's what I was referring to in that. But the overlapping generations modelling does include the type of feedback that you're encouraging us to use. And it produced similar-ish result on the debt track, a little bit higher for perhaps the reasons that you're talking about. So I think we'll have to keep moving through. There's quite a few coming through online now. There's one about, given that government responses to shocks have cost approximately 10% of GDP per decade, what do we need to change in our current fiscal strategy approach to be better prepared as we head into a significantly more volatile period in history? I mean, I'll start in with a plug for the long-term insights briefing, which we released. Draft was released in April, the final released in June. The upshot there is, as we said, look, volatility in the economy is, in the first instance, best dealt with by monetary policy. Fiscal policy does have a role. Sometimes monetary policy can be constrained, so to avoid real extremes in interest rates, perhaps governments might want to lean in there. Fiscal policy could well lean in to address the direct effects of disasters and repairing bridges and the like. And plus, fiscal policy has a role in determining who pays and when there's a disaster or a significant downturn. That document talked about the value of pre-committing to strategies for dealing with events, preparing beforehand, whether that's formal preparation like establishing funds or just letting people know what you would do in the event. And there's a lot more detail in the long-term insights briefing, but that's a different document. Is there anything else?
I mean, I think sort of underpin what Dom said. I mean, I think firstly, one of the best things we can do about giving, as I said, a lot about this document is providing governments with strategic optionality. So we say actually, if debt levels are moderate, that gives New Zealand governments the kind of headroom that they've used during like Canterbury earthquakes or COVID-19, and we think there's a value of doing that, and that underpins a lot of our advice about rebuilding fiscal buffers between shocks. At the more micro level, there's a lot, I think, for New Zealand to think about how do we better manage some of these risks. So in the climate adaptation, there's a whole set of issues about how you use insurance markets, how you have better data, planning, etc. So we mitigate some of the potential costs of at least some of these shocks in the future. As Dom says, have a greater explicit commitment about what central government will do in various kinds of situations. So I think there's a lot at both, if you like, the more macro level, but also at a more micro level that government policy can put in place to essentially make the economy more resilient to these kinds of shocks.
Sorry, just on that climate question. One is that, are you modelling for increased refugee flows into New Zealand, especially given our long-standing relationship with the Pacific? But also there's World Bank estimates that there could be 200 million refugees by 2035. Climate refugees, New Zealand would presumably want to take on some of those and would have international pressure to do so. The other one on climate is, how worried are you currently about the current settings for how to buy houses that have been destroyed by adverse weather events? I think in Auckland, they paid 90% or 95% of the value of the homes. With New Zealand house prices even dampened now, that bill can get very high very quickly.
So on the first part, I mean, no, that explicit scenario is not modelled, but certainly acknowledge that these are the types of things that could place pressure in the future. In terms of impact of climate change on the government's books, did you want to take that? We also have Melanie Craxton online.
I think the the broader point is for us as a Treasury, I think more generally thinking about a focus for us is around how insurance markets are working. We have responsibilities about working with government about policy settings around natural hazards commission, thinking about the insurance market more generally. So, it's a focus area for us because we see it as important about, managing at least some of these costs into the future, but also recognizing, that New Zealand, like a lot of countries internationally, the cost of that insurance has increased, very significantly, particularly in the last, 5 to 10 years.
Okay, we've got an online question about labour force participation remaining higher than anticipated, partly due to people remaining in the labour force longer. So how would you anticipate changes to the eligibility age of super affecting labour force participation in the future? And have you discussed disability adjusted life expectancies with the Ministry of Health to help balance those super effects with ageing? On labour force participation, yes, that's absolutely a really important part of the modelling that we've done for this. So the incentives that people have, the tax rates they face, the superannuation that they're going to receive anyway affects their decisions about whether they're going to participate in the labour force. That affects the economy and has flow-on effects. One of the things that we've really emphasised is that New Zealand has had an extraordinary change in the number of people aged between 65 and 69 who are participating in the labour force, and I understand it's just ticked over 50%, which makes us third highest in the OECD. And there's a range of factors behind that, including the age of eligibility, but one of them may well be the fact that New Zealand has very little disincentive for people aged over 65 to remain in the labour force, whereas many of our comparator countries have a situation where your pension will be diminished if you decide to continue working after a certain age, and hence fewer people make that decision. It is worth noting that in New Zealand, while over half of people aged in their late 60s they work fewer hours than people earlier in life. So the fiscal effect is what it is. Yes, we did discuss disability adjusted life expectancies with the Ministry of Health, and basically New Zealanders are living longer lives. They're also living longer. They have longer health spans. Health spans are rising more slowly than lives. So a disability affected period is also lengthening, and that's all gone into the health modelling. We'll have to make this the final question so that you've got the honour.
All right, thank you, Dominic. The last time OECD was here, they were talking about the impact of AI, and the Public Service Commissioner was talking about more government services being delivered by AI. Were you considering that at all in your model?
Did you want to?
I think. I mean, short answer is that the modelling doesn't make any kind of specific assumptions about AI. I would say to the extent that in terms of thinking about what are the options for governments to adjust policy settings, at least in part, some of the potential changes around non-benefit expenditure, may well be enabled by a range of technologies, including AI. So to the extent that I think they are potentially, facilitative of some of the adjustments that will be needed to be made. But, I think we're still very much at the early days about what that looks like in a concrete way, Susan.
Okay, I think with that we'll draw the meeting to a close. So thank you very much to those online, and thank you very much to those in person for joining us here at the Treasury. I'll close with a brief karakia. Piki te kaha, piki te ora, piki te wairua, hui e, tae ki e.